thanks everyone who's watching this live and everyone who's going to be watching this later. It's very weird talking to you since I don't see you, but hopefully this will go fine anyway. So I'm here to talk about narratives for diverse audiences today. But before that, a little short introduction about me. So I've been working in the industry since 2011, so it's soon my 10 years in the industry. And I've done everything from mobile, Facebook, and AAA games. And kind of like my most recent and greatest work was being narrative designer on Control, a lot of awards winning there. And I'm currently a narrative designer at Housemarque on an unannounced project. But hopefully you will hear something about it someday. That's all I can say. But anyway, back to the topic. Diverse audiences. Why do I think this matters? Games are the most profitable medium. I don't have the graphs to show it, but I think I saw one, I will use anecdotal data, about kind of like games surpassing film, TV, movies, everything. And yet we're kind of like often stuck with this image that games are just for boys and self-identified gamers. And that's a little bit weird. We make so much money and then we have this very kind of like close-off image. And we are mainstream. Like Fortnite, I think, has proven by far that we are something that people are aware of and talk about, but we're still kind of inaccessible, even unattractive to many people. And while it might be controversial, while still people debate about are games art, I do believe some of them definitely are. And we still have often kind of like this obliviousness and ignorance to the messages that we are sending out. And my question is, how do we change that image? How do we attract new audiences? Because we're clearly kind of like capable of it. It's just kind of like we're not quite there yet. And my solution to that is that we need to tell new kinds of stories within the games and about the games we make. And why should you care about this? Maybe you don't need to. Maybe you're happy with the current audience you have, but kind of like, just making kind of like the cold objective point is that you can make more money by broadening your existing audiences or finding completely new ones. And especially like core gamers, or like talking about PC, console, but maybe even mobile, kind of like those core gamers are already quite contested market. Like a lot of people are vying for their attention and their dollars. And maybe kind of like finding this kind of new type of audience could make it easier for you to get that audience and get some of that business. I don't know why I said it like that. And kind of like on top of that, you could get some PR and media visibility for free while there is still new ground to break by having these kind of like innovations, showcasing kind of like new viewpoints and new stories. You could get some novelty points for that. But I think you need to start doing that work within the next 5 years, or hopefully in 5 years, everything that I'm talking about will be like, oh yeah, we've already seen that. That's nothing new. Of course, with the media visibility and focusing on this kind of like attracting these diverse audiences, you might get a backlash from certain people on the internet. They might be complaining about political correctness. They might be complaining that you're pandering, yada, yada, yada. But I think we should remember that a lot of the time, these bigots are just a vocal minority. And if you manage to deter them from your game somehow, because often they will still maybe buy your game just to complain about it to their audiences on YouTube. But if you manage to keep them away, your games community might actually improve because you're keeping away these gatekeepers and people who make other people's game experience worse, especially if it's like a community or a PvP game. And maybe finally, just because you generally care about this topic and want to represent the various backgrounds that your audience comes from, they're not just one cookie cutter mold of person, and you want to avoid perpetuating stereotypes about them. So we need new kinds of narratives. And in the next slides, I've kind of like gathered my thoughts on several kind of like ways you can do this. They're a bit vague, but like it's 15 minutes. I can't get too much into detail. So my first kind of idea is new kinds of themes, especially I think we're sitting in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. A lot of us locked inside our houses. I think we've had enough bleakness and darkness in our real world, and we're looking for ways to kind of like escape from that. And a lot of the kind of like recent years, kind of like the heroes we've been seeing, kind of like tend to be very stoic and kind of like don't show emotion, don't show flaws. And I think what we're maybe a lot more looking forward is some kind of authenticity, that everyone is panicking, everyone is scared, no one knows what to do, and kind of this vulnerability, letting that show through. and also kind of like in the terms of the characteristics that we're looking for in the heroes and other people depicted in these stories, is kind of like this seriousness, and maybe changing that for self-awareness. And I think like best example in my mind is the kind of like DC universe of movies. Like we have Superman and Batman, super gritty, super grimdark, super serious. And then we have Birds of Prey, which is very colorful, flashy, kind of like, Harley Quinn is talking to you, breaking the fourth wall. And I think that was kind of like a wonderful comparison between this kind of like, gray, gritty, dark, and this colorful new way of doing things. And I prefer the latter one. I think there might be other people who disagree with that, but yeah, this is again mostly my opinion. We're also seeing kind of like, may almost make jokes about the kind of gray-brown COD FPS shooters, and I think we're seeing a lot more color. Even like Rage 2 was very neon. Like Cyberpunk is coming. Neon is very in. Color is in. And the same thing, kind of ultra realistic versus stylized. Like we've done a lot with the current technology just to make everything look so photorealistic, act photorealistic, blood spatters, physics engines, everything. And I think we also forget that, like, we don't need that to tell a good story or make a good game. We can also stylize things and still have very kind of like, motive, very real feeling experiences. And overall, kind of like, I think a lot of people are over the cynicistic, kind of like nihilistic way of looking at things, like, okay, a crisis happens and we will just all devolve into selfish, like, I got mine, fuck you situation. Like, I think we do want to see kind of like stories where we believe that we can be better, that we will act better, that kind of Star Trek future, that we kind of can overcome these things and come together. I think we want to see more kinds of stories of how we get out of these situations and retain our humanity. So kind of like, to summarize, Grimdark is out and Hope Punk is in. And there's this wonderful quote from Alexander Roland, who kind of coined the term. So Hope Punk says that genuinely and sincerely caring about something, anything, requires bravery and strength. Hope Punk isn't ever about submission or acceptance. It's about standing up and fighting for what you believe in. It's about standing up for other people. It's about demanding a better, kinder world and truly believing we can get there if we care about each other as hard as we possibly can, with every drop of power in our little hearts. And I think that's the kind of message we need, especially right now in the times we're living in. But I do think we kind of like tend to stick to these old themes because we want to justify the actions that the player takes in the game. And that takes me to the new kinds of player verbs that I'm suggesting. So if you want to build this kind of like new kinds of thematics into your game, you also must consider how does that mesh with the verbs that your player is undertaking in the game. So does your game have to include guns or violence? And if it still has to, does it have to be a central component to it? Like, can it be just something the player can do, but it isn't something the players push towards? And if it still has to be a central component, can you at least offer non-violent options, like the sneaky way, the pacifistic way? And I think two good examples of recent highly successful releases are the Untitled Goose Game and Death Stranding. And Untitled Goose Game definitely has conflict, but it is this kind of mischievous type where kind of like, while there is, like, no one really gets hurt, okay, except maybe material damages are taken, and pride is definitely injured, but kind of there is still this kind of like joy to it, joy in being mischievous. While Death Stranding definitely kind of proper AAA release with big graphics, big everything, but the main mechanic is about delivering packages. There is guns and there is combat, but the kind of like the core central thing you're supposed to be doing is delivering packages. I know it's also a Kojima game. Kojima gets to do pretty much what he wants, but why not you? Why not kind of like, follow the way that he paved? And there's also other reasons why I love these games, that they're kind of like bringing this kind of like new social awareness to the arena. One way House did it, the developer of Untitled Goose Game, is that they listed in their credits that they're working on native land and that they're going to donate 1% of their profits to the native community as part of the pay the rent movement. While Death Stranding included the kind of like movie mode for people who are not so comfortable with controller and gaming. And that caused also a lot of controversy in this kind of like story or easy modes area of discourse. And I think both of those did something that I think is valuable and more of us should be doing. But then new kinds of stories, talking about the actual narratives themselves. I think a lot of people might be familiar with the hero's journey, but if you're not, it's this kind of story template that Joseph Campbell kind of like put out as a theory in the 40s and 50s. It looked a lot of the myths and stories that kind of like we as humans have told each other and kind of like noticed that there's this kind of like pattern to them. And he called this the hero's journey, and it's got these 12 steps that are laid out. And I think I've heard a lot of people use it as a checklist because they believe that that way you'll make a successful game. But it's not really a template to making a successful like story. It's just a way that it will match with what we're familiar with. And maybe this is not what this talk is about. It's not about the familiar, it's about new things. And you got to remember that while the hero's journey has been used to tell good stories, like Star Wars is a practically, perfect example of it. It's also been used to tell like really mediocre and bad stories. So it's not a template to success. It's just template to being very similar to what the other people are doing. So other storytelling templates, the heroine's journey, taking kind of like a different view into this, kind of like what can gender bring into this journey that makes it a little bit different while kind of like retaining some of the similarities in the structure. And because this is a 15-minute talk, I had to cut some bits out. So there were a couple of other templates that I completely copied from Steve Seeger's blog. But if you Google his name, you'll find it. And he had a lot of interesting kind of templates that he'd found in the Scandinavian, Indian, and African cultures. And they were really fascinating. Definitely probably a challenge incorporating them into games, but I think a very interesting topic to look at. And what would stories be without the main character, the hero or the heroine? And kind of my question to you is, why do we see this? Why do we see this so much? So that's I think a very funny image put together from a lot of the kind of game heroes from the last 10 or more years. And if you're now making a game, I'd like you to ask yourself, does your hero stand out from this lineup? And if it doesn't, maybe think again. And I do know it's about this fascination with the everyman, that you're just this average Joe who's pushed into this weird situation and forced to kind of like grow up or just get better very quickly. But it kind of like, it's boring. And it reinforces this default as white male as the kind of like average of everything. And I think one that is maybe insulting to white males and also insulting to everyone else who gets left out of the picture. So we can do better. You can just be more interesting. Maybe just make it even blocked. But yeah, aside from that joke, kind of like, if kind of like race and gender, you don't feel comfortable about telling the stories of other people whose experience you're not familiar with, maybe you can still kind of like talk to these people and think about other ways to diversify your character. Maybe they have a non-standard body type. Maybe they're queer, they're disabled, they're neuroatypical. And if you're not familiar with that last one, neuroatypical is a kind of an umbrella term used to discuss people who have mood, behavior, or mental disorders. So for example, people on the autism spectrum would be neuroatypical. And I think these people also would like to be represented in games, and I think we can do better to showcase them. And finally, if you still must have your average Joe character, and that's fine. I'm not advocating that every character has to be something different from now on till the end. I just kind of like you to consider, can you do an ensemble cast, a bigger cast, or can you put that variety in your NPCs? But there, again, be careful about not using them as token characters and boiling them down to their kind of like stereotype. You can maybe like put in more than one person of a minority, especially because identities can overlap. We're not just one thing. We can be queer, disabled, neuroatypical people. Like these people exist, they are out there. They're not just kind of like some kind of monster that, certain people on the internet think that, oh my God, if you put that person in the game, that's unrealistic. No, those people do exist. And I think we can get much more interesting perspectives into our stories if we start thinking about things from their perspective. And villains. I can't talk about heroes without talking about villains. But again, I'm kind of like putting out this weird question, like, does your story really need a characterized villain? maybe the enemy is the system, the environment, or some kind of non-sentient entity. And that doesn't mean you make it a robotic AI, but kind of like, you know, what I worry about kind of like when we do villains is that we make them so over the top in their evilness to justify why the hero has to kind of like, you know, take them down and take them down hard, that we kind of like create these just very bland, over the top, mustache twirling evilness. And it never usually ends up being that bad, but they kind of like get defined by their need to be evil, and usually that kind of like need to justify the actions that the player overtakes any kind of character interestingness that they might have. And again, let's say your game only has one other character, and it is the villain, and you want to make them a minority character, then please pay extra attention to their presentation. Especially again, if your main character is that vanilla Joe, extra milky white person, and then this minority character, it might look very black and white in a bad way. So just pay attention. Are their looks and their behavior and their motivation, are they stereotypical? If they are, kind of like see if you can kind of like just nudge it a little bit, make them a bit more interesting. And if at all possible, make them not the only representation of that minority in your game. I think it would be much more interesting if the hero and the villain do come from that same minority, and they represent kind of like maybe different perspectives on the issue that they disagree. And I think that would be a lot more fascinating. But overall, I just want to do away with one-dimensional evil villains altogether. Like, let's make them more interesting. And here on the right, I have some couple examples of really good villains. So Eric Killmonger, I think the only good Marvel villain. And then we have Marco Inaros from The Expanse. He hasn't been seen that much in the TV show. I'm not going to spoil the books, but in books he has a really wonderful arc, and he's I think a refreshing villain in many ways. And then there's Villanelle from Killing Eve, a wonderful look at kind of like this female sociopath type of villain. Also tried to look for a person of like a female person of color as a villain, but I couldn't really find anything kind of like big. So I think there is your niche. Like, make a really interesting villain who's female and also a person of color. And there's your novelty points right there if you care about those. But then kind of like action points to take away for you to kind of like learn more about this is just to consume diverse media. Read books and comics, watch movies and TVs made by diverse creators. And then follow them on social media to kind of like learn what they care about and where they get their inspiration. And again, get inspired by them, but don't steal their work, because that would be shitty. But instead, maybe hire them. Hire a diverse team, but don't, unless they're really working on the narrative part, don't make it their job to be your diversity stamp or reader, or then pay them separately. But if you do want to pay someone separately, you might as well just get a diversity reader or a consultant. These people exist. Use them. They're extremely happy to work with you and improve your stories. But then kind of like what I've heard a lot of times when people hire these people and they give their feedback to you is that people start to come kind of like, you know, debate them like, no, it's not that bad really, because blah, blah, blah. So please, if you do hire these people, just listen to their feedback. Find your way to kind of like incorporate it, or just like at least don't debate them. You're paying them, so it's your money, but still it's a bit of an exercise in futility if you don't listen to them. And check your marketing, both to your audience and potential hires. If you're wanting to reach these people, you might want to check, is there something in your marketing and the message that you're sending that is keeping these people away, both in terms of being your audience or people you want to hire. And be accessible. I think this is something where in 2020 we can do better. And I think there's a whole website just devoted to game accessibility guidelines. And you can start from very basic stuff and get all the way to the advanced stuff. And let's bring more people in, especially because any one of us might become disabled at any point, just by pure bad luck, or you know, some people are born with these, and I think they also should get the joy of participating in these games and stories that we're making. And that's it. Wow, well, suddenly questions got out of screen, but yeah, that's my That's my
Hello, I
jam.
just popped in. Sorry, I think I didn't unmute my mic at some point there, so you probably heard my tapping. I do apologise to the
Oh,
audience.
sorry, I didn't hear anything.
You didn't. That's good. And maybe I just unmuted at the same time. Maybe I did that seamlessly. That was brilliant. And you could take a couple minutes, but it's fine. We can ask questions as well. That was really, really cool. And I think it's really important. A really important subject and something we need to debate and look at a lot more. There's a round of applause there from. As I was going to say, for a few things we haven't seen in the audience, as a female Asian game designer here, this was such a great talk, really inspiring. Thank you for this. Fantastic.
Yay.
Bit of love. You don't get a lot of claps, so you're not going to get a lot of that apart from me. But I guess, I think it's absolutely fair what you say, that you've got a lot of similar looking kind of male sort of everyman hero out there and stuff. But do you think, where do you think we stand as an industry compared to the sort of mainstream sort of media, films and television? Do you think games is behind a curve or ahead of a curve, or where would you put us?
Oh, that's a hard question. Like, we do sometimes so well, like Apex Legends. Like, it did so well for, I think, that period of 2 weeks. I think there's still people playing that, but kind of like they did that whole thing of, I think there was like one white character in the whole original lineup. And then we kind of like still get games where kind of like, it seems like we've taken so many steps back, and it's hard. It's very uneven. That's what I'd say. I think a lot of indie games are doing like really, really fantastic things with these. I think kind of like personally, just Disco Elysium is kind of like something that kind of like where you kind of represent your different thoughts in your head as kind of like dialogue. People that do dialogue in your head with aspects of yourself, it's like really fascinating looking into, not even maybe any kind of like particular diversity issue, but kind of like just that as a concept was just like mind blown. Like what could you do more with this topic? But yeah, and then you still have your CODs that are basically still the same that they were 10 years ago. They haven't advanced that much at all in my opinion. So uneven.
Do you think
I'd say
part of that obviously is a genre-related issue, and maybe a genre and an audience plays a certain genre? I don't want to get into stereotypes, but there are a lot of shooter games that are emulating wars not extensively fought by white men, of course, by any means, but it is more of a the way it's portrayed in other media as well. It's more of a sort of masculine pastime, and it's certain aspects are represented.
Yeah, I think it was kind of like when I talked about that, kind of like we need that theme to justify the actions. And those themes very kind of like often don't appeal to the people who'd maybe like to see that diversity then. So I think those two go hand in hand.
You mentioned COD, but one of our questions was, what do you think of the way the latest Call of Duty foregrounded a woman as one of the playable characters? Was that done well enough, or was that a step in the right direction?
Unfortunately, I haven't seen much of that game. I've been so busy. Like, weirdly enough, in isolation, I've been busy. So I can't say much about that. But if they did kind of like put a woman on the forefront, I'm like very happy. Good that they're taking that first step out there. But like, they're still, let's say, 5 to 8 years behind everyone else.
Yeah. I mean, I guess another thing I would say in defense of the games industry a little bit is obviously we have managed to engage with and take on board a lot of international culture. So, obviously Japanese gaming culture particularly is very much part of the console industry. So you have very sort of maybe Asian archetypes rather than Western ones. But, that has become, I don't think there's as much, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't feel there's as much of a kickback to different kind of sort of ethnic groups, maybe because of that, then maybe the male-female balance still isn't right there.
And the Japanese don't get exposed to kind of like racial minorities as much. So, of course, their games usually tend to either kind of like, just not deal with these issues or just get them quite blatantly weird and wrong.
So, weird and wrong. That's the Japanese design code. Weird and wrong. I like that.
It's weird and wrong sometimes in good ways, but sometimes in such bad ways.
But we do have as well, obviously, in, it's a fantasy format, and we often are geese or hedgehogs or little Italian plumbers or whatever. So I guess on that perspective, although the more photorealistic games still have a lot of work to do, we do still have, there is an escapism here in which we can play different roles. Maybe not enough yet. and obviously Tomb Raider. I mean, I don't know how that often, you know, Lara Croft was the breakout kind of heroine. Maybe she was kind of a problem as much as a solution. That it was she was like the one everywhere, and you know, there was maybe a focus paid to certain parts of her body and more than necessarily her athletic ability. But you know, she was obviously a really positive heroine. But no, I think it's fascinating to have this discussion to see how modern games are doing it, because it's not obviously isn't that hard to offer those choices really.
But it does take hard work, especially if you have a very kind of like homogenous team, let's say. It does take kind of like work and time and effort to get into that mindset and make sure that you're just kind of like doing it right, because kind of I think the worst of both worlds could be that you kind of like you try to go for a diverse like presentation of something,
and you get it wrong,
and then you just get it wrong, and then you're just going to make everyone unhappy.
Token just no. I guess you say it goes back to the nature of the team setup. I mean, I do wonder to a degree if the more we work remotely, whether that will encourage more diverse teams, just because it kind of
more
won't
people
matter,
can access games now, because well, more people can maybe access games because they've got nothing else to do. But maybe we're also get more used to remote cultures and virtual studios, which would open up the opportunities of employment to so many more people.
Exactly. So, maybe that will be a strength coming out. We've had a lot of talks the previous days about working remotely, and there was Chris Natsimi from Boomzap, who was very vocal and has been a pioneer and a supporter of this. And he was saying that he has you know, people working from in small islands in the Philippines that just wouldn't. Their alternative to be in the games industry would be to go to Singapore or something, or not be in it. But because remote working has allowed anybody to kind of get involved, so hopefully that will be continued. I think we're nearly at time. Just is there any because you did shout out a couple, but is there any particular other examples you'd like to say? Any absolute kind of trailblazer of we should all sort of champion and get behind that's doing the right things? Housemarque's new unreleased game. I'm sure Laurie's all over that. So
I wish I'm having that mind blank moments. Okay, there's someone called that Sayonara Wild Hearts. Yes. Of course now.
Thank
now
you,
that
Thomas Hooper. That was good.
Yes,
good save.
Thank you. But yeah, so Sayonara Wild Hearts. Yeah, I really loved. I think they pulled together a lot of the themes, like that color. Not explicit villain, like good representation, and also killer soundtrack on that one.
Yeah, no, it was a great experience, a great game.
Yeah.
Good
and Senator's Sacrifice. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. You see, people are there engaging. There we go. Oh yeah, Hellblade obviously won a lot of awards for that as well. Friend of mine, Dominic, about 5 BAFTAs. Very annoying, but never mind. Cool. Well, I think that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Eevi. You've been an absolute pleasure to have you here. When you open the blinds and see the gorgeous sunshine pouring in, I'm sure it is quite nice.
Actually, that leads indoors. That's the hallway behind me there.
You've got blinds to a wall.
So no sunlight for me. I'm finished.
Oh no, but I know the weather is quite nice in Finland at the moment. I mean, it's been a lot more. I mean, obviously it would be anyway, but it'd been a lot more mild winter, which is not everybody's happy about. But anyway, have a fantastic day.
And thanks everyone who joined and who's been in the chat. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you'll have much more feedback. So it'll be shared, as I say, to the crowd tomorrow. So kiitos and have a lovely day. Thank you very much indeed.
Kiitos.